Alright, part 2 of this learning card. We're looking at i's raised to certain powers and how to deal with those. Well, there are these things called the I facts, and we can go through, and I will go through a little bit. I to the first, well, that's just I. Okay, I to the second, well, I'm going to go out here and do a little math here. I times I, that's what I to the second is. Hopefully you understand that. And so something squared is just times itself. Well, I is the square root of -1. Sorry, it's negative times the square root of -1. Well, what is the square root of -1 times the square root of -1? I'm going to kind of go over to my calculator. I can't do the square root of -1, but how about if I do square root of 78 times the square root of 78? The reason I'm showing you that is I want you to recognize that the square root of something times itself, the square root of that same number, is, well, just the number without the radical. So the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 is just going to equal -1. So I squared, which is square root of -1 times square root of -1, is equal to -1. So this is -1. Alright, so we got I for I to the first, makes sense. -1 after a little bit of manipulation to get I squared. I to the third is I times I times I. Well, part of that makeup is we've got two i's there, which is the same thing as I squared, which we just determined was -1. So this is going to get replaced with -1, just to differentiate that. And then we still have that I hanging out there. So we're going to, anytime we see I to the third, instead of writing I to the third, we're going to substitute it with -1i or just -I. Right? I to the fourth, I. That's I to the fourth, I times I times I. We're going to take that in two components. We're going to say, okay, well, you know what? It looks like a happy face. We're going to take those two i's. That's I squared. That's the same thing as -1. And then here's another I squared. That's the same thing as -1. And we're going to multiply those. -1 times -1 is +1. Okay, so I've got the I facts are I1, I1 with negatives in the middle. I1 with negatives in the middle. These I facts are going to be really important in helping us to simplify some things. And specifically, so I raised to certain powers. I to the fifth. Well, I to the fifth can be broken down like this. 4 i's and then 1 left over. These 4 i's right here, we just determined that's the same thing as 1. So I get to replace all those with 1. And I still have that I left over. So I to the fifth actually equals just plain I. Right? I to the 10th. Well, you can break it down into 4, another 4, and 2 left over. The groups of 4, well, they're all just 1 according to the I facts. I to the fourth is 1. I to the fourth again is 1. Alright, so those things are getting multiplied. 1 times 1, well, that's just 1. And I still have 2 i's left over. I squared, well, that's -1. So the answer to this one is -1 because it was 1 times 1 times -1. Alright, I to the seventh, well, look, I got a group of 4. That cancels out because that's just 1 times something. And then a group of 3 left over. Well, I to the third is -I, so I to the seventh is -I. Alright, and then I to the 12th, that's 3 groups of I to the fourth. I'm sorry. And then so this I to the fourth, that's 1, 1, 1. So this is 1 times 1 times 1, or just 1. And so I to the 12th is the same thing as 1. So we're using our I facts. And I want you to recognize what we're really doing there, or one of the things you can think of is take that exponent, that this I to the 97. I don't want to draw out 97 i's and cancel out every group of 4. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 97 and I'm going to divide it by 4. And I'm not concerned with, like, 97 divided by 4. I'm not concerned with the 24 groups of 4. Those are all going to cancel out as 1. But that 0.25 at the end, that is the same thing as saying 1 left over out of 4. Alright, that is blah, 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 but 0.25 is the important part because that's the leftover. Anytime you see 0.25 after you divide by groups of 4, that means there was 1 left over, And if there's one I left over, that's I. Therefore, the answer to this one is I. I to the 159th. We're going to take the 159 and we're going to divide by 4. Let's see what we get. 159 divided by 4. Well, I don't care that there are 39 groups of I to the 4th because those are all just 1 times 1 times 1. But it's the 0.75 at the end that I'm worried about or interested in. That 0.75 means 3 left over out of 4. So anytime you see a decimal after dividing by 4 coming out to 0.75, that was 3 left out of 4. So 3 i's left out, and that's going to be negative I. Okay, so in each one of these where I was showing it visually, I could have taken the 5 divided by 4. The calculator would say 1.25. Therefore, I would know it was just I. 10 divided by 4 comes out to 2.5. The 0.5 that is left over is associated with I squared. That's 2 left over out of 4. So anytime you see 0.5, you know it's negative 1. This 12, if I would have done 12 divided by 4, I would have ended up with 3.0. Of course, calculator's not going to show the 0.0, but anytime you have a whole number when you divide by 4, it's like nothing left over, and that means your answer is just a bunch of I to the 4th or just 1. All right. So I know that was a interesting little way to deal with that, but the main thing is your I facts. All right.